Richard Cole, the ruthless millionaire CEO, lived his life with cold precision. Work, power, and control were all that mattered until the day she disappeared. Years ago, the only woman who had ever made him feel human walked out of his world without a word, leaving nothing but questions and a hollow ache in his chest. He convinced himself she was gone forever, buried in the shadows of his past. But fate has a cruel way of bringing back what we try to forget. One stormy afternoon, standing in the hospital hallway, Richard froze. There she was, pale, fragile, fighting for her life. And beside her bed stood two little boys, clutching each other's hands, their eyes the same shade of steel gray as his own. When their trembling voices broke the silence with one word, Daddy. Richard's entire world shattered. Richard Cole had spent years building his empire on steel, glass, and unshakable discipline. He was the kind of man people whispered about in boardrooms, ruthless, precise, untouchable. But beneath the tailored suits and carefully managed headlines, there was a memory he could never quite erase. A woman. Her 5 years ago, Emily Hayes had been everything he didn't know he needed. She softened the sharp edges of his world, bringing laughter into places that had only known silence. But just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. One night she was in his arms, and by morning, she was gone, leaving only a brief note that made no sense. I have to do this. Don't come after me. Richard had tried to bury the ache under 12-hour workdays, endless deals, and hollow social events. But the ghost of her absence followed him everywhere. He told himself she had betrayed him, that she wasn't worth his loyalty, and yet, deep down, he knew the truth. He still wasn't over her. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was late on a Thursday when his assistant rushed into his office, her face pale. Mr. Cole, it's urgent. It's about Emily Hayes. The name hit him like a blade to the chest. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Within hours, he was standing in the whitewashed halls of St. Mary's Hospital, his heart pounding like it hadn't in decades. And then he saw her. Emily lay on the bed, fragile, her skin pale against the harsh light. She looked thinner, weaker, but still achingly familiar. For a moment, Richard forgot how to breathe. Memories rushed back. Her laugh, the way she used to tease him when he worked too late, the warmth of her presence in his cold penthouse. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. Then came the sound that turned his world upside down. Mommy. Richard's gaze shifted, and that's when he saw them, two boys, no older than 4 or 5, standing at the side of her bed. Their hair was dark like his, their eyes a piercing steel gray, identical to the ones he saw in the mirror every morning. One clutched Emily's hand. The other turned, stared at Richard with wide eyes, and whispered a single word that shattered him. Daddy. The room tilted. Richard felt his carefully built walls crumble in an instant. He stumbled back, as though the weight of that word had knocked him off balance. What did you just say? He managed, his voice hoarse. The smaller boy, braver than his brother, stepped forward. His tiny chin trembled, but his voice was clear. You're our dad, Mommy said. He trailed off, glancing back at Emily, who stirred faintly but did not wake. Richard's chest tightened, fury and confusion battling within him. Emily had disappeared without a word, had cut him off completely, and now, he was staring at two children who were unmistakably his dot. The hallway noise faded. The hospital walls blurred. All he could see were those boys, their innocent eyes reflecting questions he didn't know how to answer. Memories pieced themselves together in fragments. The timing, her sudden disappearance, the way she avoided his calls. Was this why she left? Was she carrying his children and never told him? Richard's hands clenched into fists at his sides. A storm roared inside him, anger at her betrayal, anguish at the years he had missed, and an ache he couldn't name. Before he could speak again, the boys retreated closer to Emily's side, as if afraid he might vanish. Their small shoulders trembled, but neither looked away from him. The older one whispered, "Don't leave, please." The plea pierced him deeper than any business rivalry or boardroom defeat ever could. For the first time in his life, Richard Cole, man known for having no weakness, felt powerless, and for the first time in years, he realized that the life he thought he wanted was no longer enough. Richard stayed frozen at the foot of the hospital bed long after the boys' words settled like a storm in his chest. He had been called a shark, a machine, a man incapable of feeling, but standing there, looking at two children who bore his eyes and his silence, he felt something he hadn't in years: fear. When Emily finally stirred awake, her voice was faint. Richard. He stepped closer, his emotions a tangled knot. You disappeared for 5 years, and now his voice cracked as he glanced at the boys. You let me believe you were gone, while my sons grew up without me." Emily closed her eyes. As if the weight of his words was too much, tears slid down her cheeks. "I had no choice. No choice." His tone was sharp, but beneath it was raw pain. "You took my children from me. You stole 5 years I can never get back." The boys flinched at his raised voice. Richard immediately caught himself, kneeling down so he was at their level. "I'm sorry," he murmured, softer. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry because I wasn't here, because I didn't know." The older boy, Jacob, studied him with wide, uncertain eyes. The younger Eli clung to Emily's hand. Richard straightened, turning his gaze back to her. "Explain, now." Emily swallowed hard. "The night I left, I found out I was pregnant. I wanted to tell you, but then everything with your company." Richard's jaw tightened. He remembered those months' scoot-throat deals, enemies circling his empire, scandals threatening to erupt. "You were under attack," she whispered. "And I was already a target because of you. There were threats, Richard. I didn't want the boys to grow up in danger, so I ran. I thought I was protecting them." Her words sliced through his anger. He remembered the anonymous letters, the break-ins, the pressure from rivals who wanted to see him destroyed. He had brushed it all off back then, too focused on keeping control of his empire to realize how unsafe it had been for her. "You should have trusted me," he said, voice low, almost breaking. "I couldn't," Emily whispered. "Not then. You loved your empire more than anything. I didn't know if you'd even want them." Richard's chest constricted. Looking at the boys now, his sons, he couldn't fathom how she had ever doubted. "They're mine," he said fiercely, "and I would have given up everything to know them." Silence fell. Emily's tears spilled freely. The boys exchanged a glance, then Jacob spoke, his voice small. "Are you staying?" Richard looked at him, at Eli, at the family he never knew he had. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, none of it mattered in this moment. Only them. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "I'm not leaving again. Not now, not ever." That night, Richard stayed in the hospital room. He sat by the boys as they dozed off in mismatched chairs, Jacob leaning on his shoulder, Eli curled up against his arm. He didn't move, afraid that if he did, they might disappear again. When morning came, Emily stirred to find him still there, hair rumpled, tie discarded, his usually polished exterior stripped away. She studied him for a long moment. "You've changed," she murmured. Richard met her gaze. Steel gray eyes softened. "No," he admitted, "I'm just finally seeing what matters." For the next week, Richard divided his time between the hospital and the boys. He learned the rhythms of their lives. Jacob loved drawing superheroes. Eli hated carrots but adored pancakes. He listened to their stories, laughed at their questions, and for the first time in his life, he read bedtime stories instead of quarterly reports. Still, shadows lingered. Emily's decision to leave had left scars. One evening, as they sat in the quiet after the boys had fallen asleep, Richard finally voiced what haunted him. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice low. "Leaving me out of their lives." Emily looked down, fingers tracing the edge of her blanket. "Every day, but I thought I was doing what was best. For them, for you." Richard exhaled slowly, the anger in him cooling into something heavier, grief. "We lost 5 years, we can't get back. But I swear, Emily, I won't lose another." Her eyes filled with tears. "Do you mean that?" Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "I built an empire thinking it would make me powerful, but standing here, I realize I was nothing without them, without you. This is what I want, what I should have fought for all along." The room fell silent, except for the steady hum of machines. For the first time since she left, Emily believed him, and for the first time in his life, Richard Cole knew what it meant to have something worth protecting, not a company, not wealth, but family. The following days tested Richard in ways he had never imagined. His board members were furious. Rumors spread fast in the business world. Richard Cole, the unshakable CEO, was seen at a hospital day after day, his meetings canceled, his empire suddenly less important. For years, Richard had lived for their approval, for the fear in their eyes when he entered a room. Now, he didn't care. But the past he thought he'd buried wasn't finished with him. On a rainy evening, as Richard was leaving the hospital to fetch dinner for the boys, a black car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, revealing a familiar face, an old rival whose threats had haunted Richard during those turbulent years. "You should have stayed cold, Cole," the man sneered. "Family makes you weak, and weakness gets destroyed." Richard's blood ran cold. Suddenly, Emily's fear made perfect sense. She hadn't left because she didn't love him, she had left because she did. Because she knew his enemies would strike at his heart. But things were different now. Richard wasn't the same man who thought power was built on fear. That night, as he sat by Emily's bed, he took her hand firmly. "You were right to protect them, but it's my turn now. I won't let anyone hurt you or our sons." Emily searched his eyes, looking for the ruthless CEO she once knew. Instead, she found a father, a man who would burn the world before letting his boys shed a single tear. The test came sooner than expected. A week later, Emily was discharged. Richard insisted they move into his penthouse, a fortress compared to her modest apartment. Jacob and Eli marveled at the towering windows and glittering skyline, their laughter filling the cold space that had once felt like a prison. For the first time, Richard felt what home really meant. But the threats continued. Anonymous messages, shadowy figures watching the building. Richard knew his rival was tightening the noose. His company could weather the storm, but his family, that was different. Late one night, Emily found him standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. "You're worried," she said softly. He turned to her, his jaw tight. "I spent years protecting numbers on a screen, deals on paper. Now I have something real to lose, and I don't know if I can." Emily stepped closer, her voice steady. "You can, because you're not alone anymore." Her words anchored him. The final blow came during a shareholder meeting. His rival exposed private information, launching a smear campaign that threatened to strip Richard of his position. Once, that would have been his nightmare, losing control. Losing the empire he'd built with blood and sweat. But as he sat in that sterile boardroom, his phone buzzed. A photo. His boys, asleep on the couch, their small heads leaning against each other. Emily sitting nearby, smiling faintly. Richard rose, cutting the meeting short. The board gasped as he declared, "Take it, if you want. The company. The power, it's meaningless compared to what I have waiting for me at home." He left without looking back. That evening, Richard returned to the penthouse. He gathered Jacob and Eli into his arms, holding them so tightly they squealed in protest. Emily watched, tears brimming, as the man she once feared had chosen his family over everything else. "Daddy," Eli mumbled sleepily against his shoulder. "Are you staying forever?" Richard kissed his hair. "Forever? And nothing will ever change that." Emily stepped forward, resting her hand on his arm. For the first time since their separation, the distance between them dissolved. "I was wrong to doubt you," she whispered. "No," Richard said gently. "You saved them when I couldn't, but now, it's my turn. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that." Their eyes met, years of pain melting into something new, hope. Weeks later, as the sun set over the city, Richard sat on the penthouse balcony with Emily by his side and his sons playing at their feet. The ruthless CEO was gone. In his place was a father, a partner, a man who finally understood that true power wasn't in money or control, it was in love, in the small voices that called him daddy. For the first time in his life, Richard Cole was complete. Sometimes, life isn't about the empire you build, the fortune you guard, or the reputation you fight to protect. For Richard, it took one hospital room, one fragile woman, and two little voices whispering daddy to remind him of what truly matters. We often chase power, thinking it will fill the emptiness inside. But in the end, love is the only empire worth building, the only legacy that survives. Richard thought he had lost everything the day Emily walked away. Yet, fate gave him back more than he could ever imagine. Not just the woman he loved, but two sons who became the heartbeat of his world. Would you fight for love if it meant giving up everything else? Or would you walk away, thinking it was too late? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-wrenching billionaire love stories.